is a listing of the people who came back in response to Koresh's proclamation under the leadership primarily of Zerubbabel, who indeed was the grandson of Yehoiachin HaMelech, who was languishing in prison. Actually, I want to stand corrected. I think I said yesterday that Yehoiachin was still alive. That's not true. Yehoiachin had died before the Persian conquest. So Yehoiachin is not here anymore, but remember that Zerubbabel, at least in the Nevuah of Haggai, was envisioned as a Mashiach, and he could have been Mashiach. And in point of fact, Mashiach ben David will be descended from Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel is Lamaisa, the ancestor of Mashiach. And then it gives you the breakdown. So again, obviously, I'm not going to go over every single name, but I just want to show you the different classifications of people that returned, because the classifications themselves are interesting. The first group that is mentioned are a number of families from Shevet Yehuda, and they were the largest group, and they are described in two different ways that are a bit contradictory, and that is, sometimes they're described as a family group, meaning people of this family returned, and it gives you a number. And sometimes they are described in terms of the city of origin that they came from pre-Chorban. So one group might be described as this family comprised 250 people, or it might say the inhabitants of Anasot, which was a town in Eretz Binyamin, came back. So again, it would really depend. If for example, there were not a lot of members of a given family that returned, they would be aggregated with the community. So we do have Yehuda, we do have Binyamin, but there are some interesting subcategories here. So for example, in Perek Beis Pasuk Vav, it mentions Bnei Pachas Moav. And that means the sons, or the descendants really, of the governor of Moab. So that's a little intriguing. What is the governor of Moab? So actually Chazal say that this was an expression for David HaMelech, because David HaMelech came from Rus the Moabite, and these were not direct descendants, but these were in the larger family of David HaMelech that is called Pachas Moab. That's one interesting thing. Again, I just want to point out the unusual issues. The people of Beis Lechem, that's a city designation. The people of Anasot, that's a city designation. Kiryat Ye'arim, which is modern-day Tellstone, that is a city designation, etc. So it goes back and forth between families and cities. And it mixes essentially Yehuda and Binyamin. Right? So that's category one are people from the Shevet Yehuda, people from Shevet Binyamin. Category three are Kohanim. Category four are Leviim. Okay, so it's Yehuda, Binyamin, Kohanim, Leviim, which makes sense. Then the fifth category are the Nesinim. Now, this is very interesting. In fact, there are actually a very surprisingly large number of Nesinim. Who are the Nesinim? So now we have to go back to the book of Yehoshua. The Nesinim are the nation that was known as the Givonim. If you remember in the book of Yehoshua, there were Canaanites in the town of Givon, which is in the land of Binyamin, that's in the south. And they knew that the Jewish people were conquering Eretz Yisrael and they were killing the seven nations. So the Givonim disguised themselves as if they were a people that came from a faraway country. In other words, they didn't identify as Canaanites, and they wanted to make a peace treaty with Bnei Yisrael. And Yehoshua, on behalf of the nation, swore an oath of peace. And then when it was discovered that the Gevinim were deceptive, and in fact they were Canaanites, Yoshua could not kill them because of the oath, because of the peace treaty, but they were made a servant class to be chotfei eitzim, to be cutters of wood, and shoavei mayim, and drawers of water. And specifically, this was in connection with the Mishkan in Shiloh at that time, right? There was no Beis HaMikdash, you had Mishkan in Shiloh, that the Nesinim were a servant class that were involved in essentially working for the Kohanim and Leviim in the various administrative functions connected to the Mishkan, which was then in the days of Yoshua, was located in Shiloh. So why are they called Nesinim? Simply because the lashon of the pasuk in Yoshua is they were placed, Nesinim, they were placed to be chotfei eitzim v'shoavei mayim. So it's interesting that in response to Koresh's proclamation, so you had Yehuda, Binyamin, Kohanim, Leviim. You also had large numbers of Nesinim who answered the call. And proportionally, we can assume the size of the Nesinim were not huge, but we would assume that proportionally a higher percentage of them returned than Yehuda, Binyamin, Kohanim, and Leviim. Most of them remained behind. And the reason would be that the Nesinim would have more of a function. In other words, in effect, the Beis HaMikdash, the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, would give them their job. And even though, in a sense, they were servants, but there was also a certain kavod attached. Right? The Nesinim had a certain amount of kavod. So it mentions very specifically all of the different families of Nesinim that returned. Now, let's digress for a moment, and let's talk about the halachic issues of the Nesinim, because that's very interesting. There is a real kasha about the whole story in Yehoshua, and that is there's a mitzvah in the Torah that whenever we wage war, we have to first offer peace to the enemy, and only if the enemy refuses peace do we then wage war, right? This is a mitzvah of kriyas shalom. The Rambam learns that the mitzvah of kriyas shalom does not only apply to Milchemes Rishus, which are optional wars authorized by the Sanhedrin, like if we're invading Kuwait through the Sanhedrin, we have to offer them peace, although I'll discuss what peace is in a moment. It even applies to Milchemes Mitzvah, even the mitzvah war of conquering Eretz Yisrael and eradicating the 7 nations of Canaan. We don't do that until we first offer them peace. This is a big chiddush, that even though the Torah says our stance via the 7 nations is lo sechaya kol neshama, we have to eradicate them. Says the Rambam, that's only if they don't respond to the kriyas shalom. If they respond to the kriyas shalom, we let them stay. Now, what is the condition of kriyas shalom? So the Rambam says a few things. Number 1 is acceptance of the 7 commandments of Noach, not becoming Jewish, accepting the 7 commandments of Noach, such as renouncing terrorism. And number 2, accepting Jewish sovereignty over Eretz Yisrael. Essentially, the Rambam mentions paying taxes, but the truth of the matter is, the real import of paying taxes is not so much writing a check, it's the acknowledgement of the Jewish sovereignty over the land. So again, pay attention to this. If an Amorite or a Canaanite accepts the 7 commandments of Noah and accepts Jewish sovereignty over Eretz Yisrael, that Canaanite, that Amorite, is allowed to live in Eretz Yisrael, and the mitzvah of lo sechaye kol neshama does not apply. Now, I want to point out, this is the Shitas HaRambam, that the mitzvah of kriyas shalom applies even in Milchemes Mitzvah. Okay, keep that to the side. Rashi's Shita, in Maseches Saita and other places, is a much more extreme view. According to Rashi's Shita, it is only before we cross the Yarden that we would offer them a chance to get out and leave. But once we cross the Yarden and we're ready to conquer, they don't have the option of Kriyas Shalom. There's a mitzvah of Lo Sechaya Kol Nashama. Now, again, I'm not here to address the obvious questions people raise. Israel today is accused of genocide and everything else, and Holocaust, and we are. The very, very people who were victimized by the Holocaust are accused of doing Holocaust. This is the very, very popular mantra in the Jewish community about genocide. And when Netanyahu mentioned Amalek, that wasn't the most helpful mention in terms of public relations and the like. But people do have this issue. Forget about Netanyahu. Forget about Gaza. Let's go back to the Torah itself. The Torah says we come to Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, there's real ethnic cleansing. Eradicate this Amalek and the 7 nations of Canaan, and do not leave anybody alive, men, women, children. So obviously it's going to bother us a little bit. Gee, how do you deal with genocide, ethnic cleansing, everything else? So I just want to point out, I'm not going to give you a whole answer to this, but I just want to point out that, like the Rambam, the question is much less, because according to the Rambam, it's not a wholesale genocide. We offer them peace. And the peace is not overly onerous. It's accepting the basic morality of the Noahide laws and accepting Jewish sovereignty. And if they do that, they can remain even in Eretz Yisrael. So again, that doesn't fully eliminate the question, because Lamaisa, if they don't agree, we do eradicate them. But at least there's a chance. There's an alternative road. Like Rashi, the genocide, I'm being honest, the genocide question is a much more serious question, because according to Rashi, once we cross the Yarden, even if they're begging for peace, we don't accept it. Okay. So this is a very important machlokas historically. What was our relationship to the 7 nations? And even Amalek. Even Amalek, the Rambam says there's Kriyas Shalom once we cross the Yarden. Now, here is the problem with the story of the Givonim. Like Rashi, the story actually is relatively simple. As Canaanites, once we crossed the Yarden, the Givonim did not have the right to live. They were Chayav Misa. But they tricked us into making a Shavua. So Yoshua felt that if we break a peace treaty, now technically, even though there was an oath, you understand that the oath is not binding. For actually 2 reasons why it's not binding. Number 1, it was procured by fraud. And number 2, it's an oath to violate the Torah. If the Torah gives you a mitzvah to kill, then even an oath that I'm not going to kill is like making an oath I'm not going to wear tefillin. So Lamaisa, according to Rashi, the Shavua was not binding. Okay, that's true. Nevertheless, Yoshua felt there would be a Chilul Hashem in violating a promise that we made. So Yoshua was kind of forced to let them live, and they became the servant class. So like Rashi, the story of the Givonim is a fairly understandable narrative. According to the Rambam, though, the story of the Givonim is very perplexing. Why did they engage in deception in the first place? If indeed, even after we cross the Yarden, the Rambam says there's a mitzvah of Kriyas Shalom, and the requirement of Kriyas Shalom is simply accepting the 7 commandments and Jewish sovereignty. So the Givonim could have shown up and said, hey, we are Canaanites. From the town of Givon, we are surrendering to you. Here's the white flag. We will accept the 7 commandments of Noah, and we will accept Jewish sovereignty over our town or over Eretz Yisrael. In other words, according to the Rambam, the whole story of the Givonim is a bit inexplicable, because there was no need for the ruse to begin with. See, like Rashi, it's a much more understandable story, although you have the ethical issue according to Rashi. Like the Rambam, what's going on? So the Rambam actually says, you're right. The Givonim didn't have to do what they did. But they didn't know. They didn't know the halacha. They didn't know that they had the opportunity for Kriyas Shalom. So as a result, they thought this was the only way they could save their lives. But then you have another question. Well, the other question is, okay, the pasuk in Yeshua is mashma that Yeshua would have killed them had it not been for the promise and the chilul Hashem. But why is that so? If Lamaisa they accepted Shalom, then they wouldn't be Chayav Misa. In other words, in terms of the Givonim's deception, we could answer, they didn't know, so they thought they had to engage in deception. But in terms of Yeshua's response, if Lamaisa they accepted Shalom, why would Yeshua kill them had it not been for the Chilul Hashem? So the Rambam kind of fetches around here. The Rambam says, well, yeah, they didn't deserve to die because they were Canaanites, but they deserved to die because of deception. Well, I'm not sure why deception, which was not necessary in any event, why deception is something for which you have to give your life. So all I can tell you is that the Rambam himself acknowledges that according to his explanation, the story of the Givonim is a bit more difficult. Now, Lamaisa, the Gemara in Yevamos discusses yet another aspect, and that is, although it would seem that the Givonim never became Jewish, at most they accepted the 7 commandments of Noach, but it seems that at some point in time, and it may not have been Yeshua's time, they actually converted to Judaism. Okay, now again, you do not see that at all from Sefer Yoshua, and it's not clear if the conversion happened then, or maybe it didn't happen then, it happened later. So the question then becomes, if a Givoni converts to Judaism, are they allowed to marry a Jew? So, according to Rava in Maseches Yevamos, there is a prohibition in the Torah against marrying anyone from the 7 nations of Canaan, even if they convert. Which means we're not going to kill them, according to the Rambam, as long as they accept the 7 commandments of Noach and Jewish sovereignty. We're not going to kill them, and they can stay in Eretz Yisrael. But we're not allowed to marry them, even if they undergo a full conversion. So you see the hierarchy here. In other words, there are 3 possibilities. If they don't accept the 7 commandments of Noach or Jewish sovereignty, we kill them. If they accept the 7 commandments of Noach and Jewish sovereignty, we let them live, and they could even be in Eretz Yisrael. And obviously we can't marry them because they're still Goyim. But the highest category is they undergo a full conversion. They're Jewish. They count for a minyan. They put on tefillin. They say brachos. But because, just like the Moabite, right? Just like there are certain categories even after they convert and they're Jews, we don't marry them. So according to Rava in Maseches Yevamos, there's an Isser to marry anyone who is descended from the 7 nations of Canaan, even if they have converted, which means they could marry each other or whatever it will be. Okay, that's the sheet of Rava. There's another Mandi Amar in the Gemara that says the Oraisa, if the Givonim converted, we could marry them, but there was a din d'Rabbanan not to marry them because of their deceitful behavior. So the bottom line is that Nesinim cannot marry into the Jewish people. There is a machlokas in the Gemara if that is a din d'Oraisa or that is a din d'Rabbanan. Okay? And that's one of the reasons why in the book of Ezra, the families of Nesinim are identified. See, there are 2 different reasons why is it so important to know the names of families or communities that came back? Right? I mean, you're going to read the names. I assure you, you don't know any of them. You don't know who is B'nai Chushim. These are names that no one has any idea what they were. But at the time the book was written, these were families that were well known. So there are 2 different reasons why the book of Ezra makes such a big deal about these lists. One is, it is a badge of honor, meaning we want to have a permanent memorial about the pioneers who came back to Eretz Israel after 52 years. Let me point out that whatever the challenges of Aliyah are today, multiply it by 10 billion, and those were the challenges then. They did not have Ben and Jerry's. They did not have Skippy peanut butter. They did not have air conditioning. The land was desolate. It was destroyed. It was decimated. So there is and this is only 10% of the population that came back, Be'erech. So this is a badge of honor. We want to memorialize the people who came back. So we don't just mention the total numbers. We mention this family and that family and this family and that community, and that community, because these are the pioneers. But there is a second reason why certain things are mentioned, is there needed to be a record of who was pasul and who was not pasul. We need to have a record. You can call it blacklisting, whatever. A few years ago, I mean, and things like, in the modern secular society, all sorts of things look bad, even though they're just halachically necessary. The Rabbanut has to keep a record, unfortunately, of people who are mamzers. I mean, there are mamzerim, though people commit adultery, and there are kids that are mamzerim. Now, the Rabbanut has to have a record of mamzerim because it has to determine who can marry whom. A mamzer can marry another mamzer. A mamzer can marry a gioris, right? But a mamzer can't marry a regular Jewish person. So there is a registry. It's not open to the public, but there's a registry that the Rabbanut has to have as to who is a mamzer. Now, that is necessary. So a few years ago, the Jerusalem Post, somehow uncovered the story about the black list that the Rabbanut maintains of people who are stigmatized, etc. And it became like a scandal, like, you're just like a racist or whatever it would be. So the truth of the matter is, this is very, very similar. We need to know which families by name are Nesinim, and we'll have other families as well. So on one hand, it's two opposite ideas. It's the badge of honor that these were the guys that had the courage to come back. But we also need to know that they're pasul, either Dorais or Drabanan, from marrying into Klal Yisrael. You're going to see that Nesinim is only one group of people that are pasul. There'll be other groups of people that are pasul as well. Okay, so that's a little bit of the story of the families of the Nesinim that are mentioned in great, great detail. Every single family of the Nesinim are mentioned. And then there's another curious group that's linked with the Nesinim, and they are called, they're not a halacha category, but apparently that's an important Tanakh category, called B'nai Avdei Shlomo. The descendants, not the sons, the descendants of the servants, the Avadim, the slaves, of Shlomo HaMelech. Who are B'nai Avdei Shlomo? So this refers to non-Jewish slaves, which are called Eved Kanani, although Kanani is Labdavka. It means a non-Jewish slave. Now again, let's go over what we know a little bit. I'm sure in the course of Mishnah and Gemara, you've come across the idea of Eved Kanani many, many times. Eved Kanani is a non-Jewish slave. Now, when a non-Jewish slave is either purchased, right? How does one get a non-Jewish slave? Well, today I can't really tell you, but in the ancient world, there were three ways you got a non-Jewish slave. One was prisoner of war. One was you bought it from non-Jewish slave owners that had non-Jewish slaves, so you bought it. And the third is, once it's your slave, if the slave has a child, the child is born a slave. So it can either be born in your house, it could be purchased, or it could be a prisoner in war, an Eved Kanani. Once you have an Eved Kanani, what are you supposed to do with that Eved Kanani? So number one, if it's a male, he gets a bris as an Eved. And this goes all the way back to Avraham Avinu, when Avraham Avinu was told not just to circumcise himself, but to circumcise his slaves. Number two, the Eved Kanani goes to the mikveh. Now, these are the same rituals as conversion, but this is not really a conversion. It transforms him from being a goy to a new status of Eved. Now, Eved does have a halachic status. An Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish slave, is chayav in mitzvos. But is only chayav in the same mitzvos that a woman is chayav in. So an Eved Kanani keeps Shabbos, keeps kosher. An Eved Kanani does not wear tefillin, or at least is not obligated to wear tefillin. If he's allowed to wear tefillin, that'll be the same shaila. Is a woman allowed to wear tefillin? Okay, that's another issue. An Eved Kanani is patur from the sukkah because women are patur from the sukkah. Why are women patur from the sukkah? Because it's a mitzvah saseh, shezman grama. Remember the Mishnah in Sukkah. The Mishnah in Sukkah tells us that if you're in a sukkah with a bed, you're not allowed to sleep under the bed because you're not under the roof of the sukkah, you're under the roof of the bed. But then it mentions Rabbi Gamliel had a slave, Tavi, who was a very learned Eved Kanani, and apparently Rabbi Gamliel was very fond of Tavi. And Tavi would always join the family in the sukkah, but he would sleep under the beds. And Rabbi Gamliel said, my Eved is a Talmid Chacham, and he knows that women are exempt from the sukkah, and therefore slaves are exempt from the sukkah, and that's why he slept under the bed, to be sure that none of us sleep under the bed, because he is patur min sukkah. So an Eved Kanani is chayav in mitzvos keisha, which is interesting. What bothers me a little bit is that an Eved Kanani can also be a woman, and that's called a shifcha kananis. Now, if a shifcha kananis, like an Eved Kanani, is chayav in mitzvos like a woman, that would mean that the shifcha kananis is totally the same as a woman, but she's not Jewish. It's very, very strange. She's not Jewish. She's the intermediate category of shifcha, but the intermediate category of shifcha is identical to the full category of Jewish. So I don't really get that myself. In what way, I mean, other than the fact that she's a slave, but in what way is a shifcha different than a full Jewish woman? An Eved is different because an Eved is only chayiv in mitzvahs kiisha. Now, when the Eved Kanani is freed by a document like a get, so then he becomes a full-fledged Jew. An Eved that is set free becomes Jewish legamri. Okay. Now, while he is an Eved or a shifcha, a Jewish person is not allowed to have relations or marry them. They're puzzle. When they're freed, they have a din of a ger or a gioris. But while they're in a state of abdos, not. Now again, although it's not our subject, just to mention very, very brief, I think this may have come up mamish in the last Q&A, the morality of slavery. It's not our topic, but Derech Agav, I'll mention it because it is a burning question. That is, most of us intuitively feel that slavery is a very bad thing. It's an assault on human dignity. It is not right to treat human beings like property, whether it's a Jew or a non-Jew. So what is this thing with the Torah legitimating slavery? Now, Bishlama, the so-called Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave, that I can give you a fairly simple answer. If you study the treatment of a Jewish slave, you see it's not really slavery. Slavery is not even the right term. It simply means a worker for whom I'm providing room and board. So that's not really slavery. But an Eved Kanani is bona fide slavery, and indeed Chazal constantly say an Eved Kanani is property, although you're not supposed to abuse him or anything else. So how do you understand this? I mean, the Torah is supposed to be perfect. How can the Torah legitimate something that we consider to be immoral? So these answers may not satisfy you, but I'll give you the two answers that are commonly given. Answer number one is the Torah was conceding to what was commonly accepted at the time, meaning all countries, all nations had slavery. And in their slavery, there was a great deal of brutality, abuse, torture. The Torah could not have simply abolished slavery at the time because that would not have been accepted even by the Jewish people. So instead, the Torah took an existing institution and tried to humanize it, tried to civilize it, tried to make it a more humane type of thing, with the hope and the expectation that in the passage of time it would eventually wither away, as was indeed largely the case. Not totally the case, even to this day. There are instances of slavery, but by and large it's no longer a major phenomenon, which means the Torah is tolerating an evil by trying to make it better. That's explanation number one. Explanation number two is that slavery was seen as a way of civilizing the decadent pagan culture, because the Canaanites or other nations, they were filled with murder and incest and promiscuity. And by bringing them into a Jewish family, they would be exposed to morality and Kedusha. And as a result, you might call it a way of civilizing the savage beast. Now, this, by the way, was actually commonly invoked in the 19th century in America as an excuse for black slavery. And you understand that that could offend people in different ways, and I'm not talking about that slavery, but these are two different ideas. Do you look at slavery as a concession to something that fundamentally is not a good thing? Or was there a benefit in civilizing the savage by bringing them under a religious framework? Now, I will mention that the first pshat is difficult. The first pshat, that slavery was tolerated and never desirable, I have a bit of a problem with that, because if you're going to tell me that, then it would seem that there's a great mitzvah to free a slave. And yet the halacha is the other way around. You're not allowed to free a slave unless there's some compelling reason, like making a minyan or the like. So that implies that slavery is not regarded as an evil thing. It was regarded as a good thing. Okay, again, that's our digression. But now let's go back to this category called Avdei Shlomo. Shlomo HaMelech, obviously, which was hundreds and hundreds of years before this, right, had many, many slaves. And at some point in the course of time, now these slaves were not like living under whips. These slaves were, Shlomo HaMelech's slaves were pretty rich. I mean, they had their expense accounts, etc. And eventually, they went rogue. Essentially, they stopped being slaves and they kind of mingled in the general population. But halachically, they were never freed. So it's like you had this mixture of, let's say, Fortune 500 wealthy business people who happened to be the descendants of the slaves of Shlomo HaMelech, which actually means they were halachically avadim. Now, because they were halachically avadim, they were not allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael. So as a result, in the census of Zerubbabel's Aliyah, it includes the two groups together, the Nesinim and the descendants of Avdei Shlomo, because both of them have a common denominator, that they are not permitted to marry within Klal Yisrael. And as I indicated, the purpose of Zerubbabel's list is twofold. It is to honor the people who came, but also to indicate very clearly, by name, these are named, not just aggregate totals, which families cannot be intermingled with because they come from these tainted descents. Okay, so that's the idea. Now again, halachically, there is no category called B'nai Avdei Shlomo. It is simply the halacha of an unliberated Eved Kanani. And it's a davar pashut that an unliberated Eved Kanani is not allowed to marry into the Jewish people. Okay. So we've listed so far, again, Yehuda, Binyamin, Kohanim, Leviim, Nesinim, B'nai Avdei Shlomo. Okay, those are our categories so far. Okay, Rav Usher Weiss, I think, is speaking downstairs, so I'm going to stop here so we can go hear Rav Usher.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.